We now have a period of some general questions, so I'd like to go through in the order of the presentations and just ask some questions that have been occurring to people through this period. In the first instance, could I ask you, Eleni, what food system innovations do you think have a potential to make big impacts in accelerating progress?
Well, I think one of the things that maybe we need to look at is artificial intelligence. I think that there is a huge potential for AI to impact on agriculture in ways that, really at this point, we're just really at the tip of the iceberg in terms of using smart farming, precision analytics, smart irrigation, vertical farming that relies on sensors to basically determine optimal applications of irrigation, fertilizer, etc. So I think AI is one big class of sort of emerging technologies that I have a lot of excitement about. The other one would be blockchain. I think anything transactional, and people talk about blockchain like it's going to be the next, as big as the internet itself. I don't know, but I do think that again, we're just starting to look at how blockchain can be applied to agriculture, smart contracts, anything that is transactional in terms of commerce, of supply chain, logistics, distribution. Fertilizer distribution, input distribution in general, the financial transactions vis-a-vis rural, all of that can be put on blockchain in ways that would be very, very efficiency enhancing. So I think if I were to pick, those would be the two sort of classes of technology that I think would shift the game. And I want to say one thing which I forgot to mention earlier is that people are now talking about leapfrogging with these emerging technologies layered on top of genetics and the things that we've all been thinking about when we talk about agricultural innovation. So in a sense, we're now talking about the second green revolution, and maybe in countries where we haven't yet had the first green revolution, which is biology, genetics, to have on top of that big data and all of these emerging technologies that I've mentioned really is the engine that I think we might be seeing, and the potential to leapfrog that I think makes this very exciting.
Thank you. Well, before we let you off the hook, you mentioned blockchain, and I assume this is about traceability of product. And the benefits of this are often portrayed as being for consumers in supermarkets and so forth. How do you see it feeding back to innovation in the countries where it is really needed?
Well, for example, coffee traceability, for example, we're looking at a potential project in Ethiopia where basically also for the farmers there is also that additional transparency and value that would come back to the farmers from being in this traceable system that is put on blockchain. So that's, I think, a quick thing. The other thing is smart contracts. I think that's the other part of blockchain that we also should be looking at is anything, for example, vertical integration, contract farming, any of those types of things where there are, there's a bilateral contract, to be able to put that into a ledger system is protecting both sides. So it also protects the farmer. So I think that's another value back.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Rhoda, if I could move on to you, please. And you talked more in terms of policy, which I think is most important, and it's a benefit that we've mixed the two together in this panel. So how do you think we could translate rapid advances in technology to accelerate the reducing hunger and malnutrition? And I'm picking up particularly on your point, which was almost an aside, where you said it's a good policy on paper. How do we translate it into action?
Thank you very much. So I think most of the discussions this morning and even yesterday has been centered around the food system. So I think we should now start focusing more on policies that support the entire food system. And that includes a lot of focus on bringing in the private sector the encouraging innovations in technology, as well as identifying the human capital that has potential to yield the intended results. The youth, for example, there's been a lot of talk around the youth and also bringing in the women a lot. So I think policies now should center more on the food systems. Even the coordinated policies that I talked about, it's coordination across sectors and mostly focusing on different sectors of government that play a role in malnutrition, talking about the education sector, the social security, agricultural, health, but there isn't so much attention on how we crowd in the private sector. So I think if we are talking about technology and innovations in technology, it's very important that we lay a good or conducive environment for the private sector to flourish. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So in that context, in your country of Zambia, what would be the constraints? Would it be the information technology, or would it be other mechanisms that are constraining this?
Right now, I think the most constraints is around resources. As I mentioned, we have very good policies on paper, but if we look at the allocation of resources, they don't speak to what the policies intend to achieve. We are one of those countries that have been analyzing the nutrition budget, and we've been trying to see where the resources are allocated. Even the agricultural budget points to the fact that most of the programs that are prioritized more of those programs that in the end have some political influence. And the e-voucher system that I mentioned is trying to, instead of completely discouraging input subsidies for the smallholders, which I think they've got a very good political intention and very difficult to eliminate, but at least to try and put them in a way that will still work for political objectives, but also will have intended results for the smallholders. So to try and be more innovative and see a way in which the subsidies would be smart and address the productivity and also the poverty challenges that the country is facing. So we see that the private sector has been crowded in, because when farmers are given the e-voucher, they would go to any agro input shop and get whatever inputs they want. And that has made more young people establish in those agro shops in the rural areas where the big Monsantos cannot reach. So I think those are some of the ways that we try and help crowd in the private sector in a more innovative way. Thank you.
Thank you. And I could also see you're alluding to the things that have happened in Africa using SMS as a communication rather than jumping to smartphones like the rest of the world, and developing systems such as M-Pesa, which actually are more efficient in some ways than our own banking systems in developed countries. These type of innovations are homegrown, and that's the private sector in Africa. Very good point. Thank you. Joshi, could I ask you a very old-fashioned question, even though we're talking about innovation? You talked about the farmers and the new technologies that they are adopting. What about farmers inventing things themselves? The innovation that comes from farmers that can then be transferred to other farmers. Do you have examples of that in Nepal?
Actually, at farmers level, we have a very traditional techniques, and farmers themselves have a very less number of innovations. And therefore, we impose, or we have given them the new innovations after discussing with certain key figure. There is possible in some areas, some farmers are key innovators. And sometimes we say farmers are the plant breeders as well. In some places, some cases, some farmers, they are doing themselves some kinds of breeding. They have developed some variety, doing by themselves. These techniques can be transferred from one farmer to another farmer. And we have a very remote area, even farmers doesn't have access to road. Everything they have to depend themselves. They have very limited linkage. I think the information technology, if we could provide to each farmers, it will be more benefited even to exchange the farmer innovations among themselves or between the farmers. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Paul, you come from Singapore. We know it's a hotbed of innovation, and you've given us some general concepts as to how this works. Singapore, a country without much land, has also set up a significant research base in agriculture and food. Mm-hmm. How is this using the technologies that Singapore is famous for, and how may that benefit what we're talking about today in accelerating reductions in hunger and malnutrition?
Well, in the first place, I think Singapore's got a pretty open economy. So it doesn't rely on just technology that's produced internally, but it draws in technologies from elsewhere. And that really is a smart thing to do, because no one country can invent all the technologies it needs. Yeah? But at the same time, we're working with the government at the moment on a new initiative to form a center of excellence on smallholder farm management that can hopefully benefit everybody else around the world. And the idea is to use Singapore's status as a kind of a coordinating center, really, because of its neutrality and because it doesn't have significant agriculture. So it relies on countries from around the world to produce enough so that it has, in fact, stocks to import in the country. So what we're hoping to do really is, as a country, and I can't speak for the government's personal opinion here, as a country, leverage on what others are doing, coalesce the technologies in the usable forms, and then spread it out. Because I'm also reminded by one of the FAO reports about how in today's world, I think national food security really depends on regional food security and global food security. And embedded in that, of course, is trade. If we don't have countries that can export, countries like Singapore are doomed, really, because we've got no food to import from. Yeah? So the sharing of technology is very key indeed. And if I may, actually, just building on what Eleni said, in fact, I think there are 9 disruptive technologies today in ICT, which are really exciting for us who monitor the situation. I think blockchain is just one of them. And blockchain is important because, not just because of transparency, but integrity to prevent food fraud, which is emerging as a big issue in Asia. Food identification and food fraud. I'm actually surprised that this hasn't come out during this conference so far. Yeah. So on that note, I rest my case.
You rest your case. Thank you very much. We're doing very well for getting ideas out here about what we have done. Let's talk about ideas that go beyond what has been done. I'd like to just run through quickly in the remaining time and ask each of you, what action-oriented process can we take? Can be a process, can be a policy, can be a technical innovation. Just one, so that people here can start thinking more widely about what to go home with from your own experience. So please, Eleni, what ideas do you have for action orientation in the future?
Well, besides all of the things I've already said, I think that there is an area that we don't seem to talk about enough, and that would be urban agriculture and indoor agriculture. I think that that's really where we have to also be looking at, and this with the rate of urbanization, the idea that when we think of agriculture, we're talking about small farmers on small plots out in the rural areas. Yes, of course that's true, but that's not all. And we need to think about how people will be growing food in, on vertical structures, soilless, with water piping through, with sensors that water those plants. All of this is within our reach. It's not as expensive and as high-tech and as unattainable as we might think. It's just as today implausible, that we'll all be sitting here with computers in our phones. Well, that's, I think, where we're going to be headed. So I think we should be looking at that in a much more direct way.
Thank you. Rhoda?
For me, I think I still emphasize on the policies that are centered around the entire food systems, taking into account also sustainability in terms of food production. I think right now, because we are so eager, especially in Africa or in my country where production is still relatively low for most of the foods, where we want to increase productivity, we tend to forget about sustainable ways of producing the food. And then going a step further, I think we've been experiencing a lot of post-harvest food losses. I think we need more technologies in terms of processing that food. So if we have policies that will mandate certain production in a certain way, as well as going further processing and preservation of foods in a certain way to reduce the post-harvest losses, I think we would achieve intended objectives in terms of food production in a more diverse way, as well as consumption. Thank you.
Thank you. Joshi.
Yeah, right now, during the keynote presentations, we saw 300,000 species may have potential to end the hunger. But the problems, the majority in the world are focusing only few crops. And my assumptions, my perceptions, if we can identify at least one staple crops for particular sites and focus on that particular site, it helps to end the hunger. And it's not so difficult to take the actions for making any crops in a particular site to make it as staple crops. In case of in Nepal, we have very difficulty because it's very difficult to transport from low area to high hills. We don't have a road access to high hills. That's why our assumptions and our future plans also is to make the crops a staple in a particular site. That means identification of site-specific staple crop. This is my visions, and we are working on that as well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Paul.
I was going to say what Eleni said, but I'll build on that. I think what's critical is look at the demand side of the food equation. I think we need to change consumers' mindsets, their eating habits, and also involve consumers in deciding what kind of food should be grown. If there is no demand for sustainably produced food, you're not going to have a supply chain that goes to that. So I think changing consumer habits is very important. And linked to that is the question of waste, food waste, which we have touched on peripherally in this conference. That's one of the most critical issues facing us. Yeah, and there's so much technology for that. Food waste and food fraud together. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and thank you, all of you. We've had a rich session here, and we have stuck pretty much to time. I'd like you to thank the whole panel, and as they leave the stage, let me just mention that we have covered business, policy, government, and country initiatives here. This is part of the interaction that is part of innovation. It's not the whole, these are ingredients, and what we're looking for is more ingredients that stimulate innovation. So please join me in thanking this panel.